Hello, AP Biology students. We're going to go over the sixth section in Unit 5. And in this section, we're going to talk about something called human genetic disorders. Remember that the autosomal chromosomes are going to be chromosomes 1 through 22, and these genes don't determine the sex of an individual. Any disorder that's going to be on those chromosomes 1 through 22 is known as an autosomal disorder. And these disorders are going to roughly occur in even numbers between males and females. An autosomal recessive disorder is an individual that's received two recessive genes that's going to be homozygous recessive and has the disorder. So in this case, we have something called a carrier, which is an individual who is heterozygous. They are like big A, little a, and they don't have the disorder, but they carry it, which means they have one recessive gene that they could pass on to their offspring. Typically, we see autosomal recessive disorders skip generations since as long as they have one dominant allele, they won't have the disorder. You can see in our example here, two parents that are carriers or are heterozygous for this disorder. They're unaffected, which means they don't have the disorder. Their chance of having a child without the disorder is 3/4, since you can see this individual is homozygous dominant and doesn't have the disorder, and these two individuals are heterozygous and also don't have the disorder. The only time their children will have the disorder is if they inherit two of these recessive alleles and are homozygous recessive. However, it's important to remember that these two individuals are still carriers, but they don't exhibit or have the disorder. An example of this is cystic fibrosis. The CFTR gene produces a protein in the lung cells that expels chloride ions and helps keep mucus in a more watery concentration. The gene for this CFTR protein is going to be found on chromosome 7. Whenever the CFTR gene is mutated, it's going to create a mutated protein that doesn't allow the passage of ions. This is going to in turn make the mucus build up and create infections in the person that are deadly. So the recessive gene, or the mutated version of the gene, is the small recessive letter. If an individual has at least one of the dominant or normal CFTR genes, they won't have this disorder. Only people that are little a or homozygous recessive will have that cystic fibrosis disorder. An autosomal dominant disorder is when a person only needs one copy of a gene to have the disorder. In this case, we don't see skipping of generations, since as long as you have one of them, you're going to have the disorder. This is kind of backwards from the autosomal recessive disorder, where as long as you have one of those dominant alleles, you're going to have the disorder. Like in the autosomal recessive disorders, these are very rare. If we think about evolutionary speaking, why would these different disorders persist if they are deadly? We'll talk about something called the heterozygous advantage when we talk about evolution, but we'll also see that some of these disorders occur later on in life after these genes have already been passed on. For example, a gene that's associated with Huntington's disease is on chromosome 4. Mutations on this gene can lead to that Huntington's disease that occurs later on in life. And as long as you have one of these genes, you increase your risk of developing that Huntington's disease.